The complexity of poverty, who's poor and who's not. So, what is poverty? Poverty is a failure to meet basic needs, both material and non material, due to a lack of resources, opportunity, and appropriate means of obtaining the two. Poverty encompasses elements that are both qualitative and quantitative assessments of the human condition in individuals. So, let's break this down. Poverty is easy to oversimplify. It's not just income, or access to resources, or education, or social status, or geographic location, food security, or employment status. These are certainly factors.
The official poverty measure that the United States still uses today was developed in the 1960s. There are two parts of that measure: the setting of a threshold and the way in which people are counted. The threshold measures the amount of food that was spent on a diet based in the 1960s. The number is adjusted for inflation and multiplied by 3 to include other expenses. While it does take into consideration family size and number of children, it does not include several other necessary components. For example, taxes paid or refunds received, food stamps, other government benefits, child care, and transportation costs for work. To determine if someone is poor in this measure, you simply look at the threshold and compare that to the person's or household's income, taking into account the family size. It's considered an absolute measure because it measures the resources you have compared to the cost of goods you need to buy. According to John Iceland, this measure does have some significant advantages because it is easy to understand and reiterates the idea that many people like to believe, that there is a fundamental measure of income that is needed to live. Consider a family of 4. The annual income that this family has is $25,000. Judging by the measure on the last slide, this is above the poverty line. But wait, with another child, the family is now below the poverty line by $3,000 according to the OPM. According to the government, however, it costs $12,000 to raise an infant in the first year of life, not just the $3,000 increase, one of the drawbacks of the OPM. It sounds easy, but what about the other components that the OPM fails to consider, including taxes, cost of living, health care, and other problems that can significantly affect a family income, especially in different geographic areas? The SPM is one way of addressing those problems. It takes into account government benefits and subtracts taxes, work expenses for transportation and child care. It's also adjusted for geographic location. It calculates a threshold to measure who is in poverty and who is not, similarly to the OPM. However, it takes into account expenditures on food, clothing, shelter, and utilities by geographic region, making it significantly better than the OPM from that standpoint. The SPM is a quasi-relative measure because it takes into account what other people have and determines the standard of living according to that as well. The poverty threshold therefore goes up when the standard of living goes up, which is one of its greatest benefits. This can still be a poor measure of other factors. They both measure financial resources, and the OPM and the SPM do not take into account several other considerations that cannot easily be quantified. For example, control over one's environment, education, and freedom to choose one's own activities.
Although the OPM has been measured over time and is simple for many people to understand because of the threshold, the SPM, it only takes into account income and not any other in-kind of benefits. The SPM is a better measurement because it does count many of the in-kind benefits, but is still not a complete ideal measurement. On the other hand, capabilities take into account the opportunities that a person has to be successful and are not measured just based off of income. Unfortunately, these measurements are qualitative and are impossible to measure. Nussbaum argues that capabilities are the ability, capacity, or freedom to choose a being and doing for oneself. Functionings are the beings and doings of a person. Capabilities are the freedoms that allow people to achieve and pursue their functionings. More specifically, basic capabilities are the aptitudes of a person which allow them to develop skills and talents. Internal capabilities are the developed skills and talents that are developed in social, political, economic, and familial environments. Finally, combined capabilities are the total amount of opportunities available in the economic, political, and social situation. Nussbaum argues that there are 10 capabilities that each citizen should obtain in a developed country. Citizens should have the right to a life that does not end prematurely, the right to make their own decisions concerning their bodies, and the right to feel emotions and have human connections, just to name a few. But we can't exactly measure all these things because capabilities are qualitative, and the government cannot create a system of measurements to define poverty based off of these things. An example of functionings versus capabilities begins with two students who had the exact same ACT score and GPA. These students have the exact same functionings in the classroom, and therefore one would think that they would have equal opportunity. On one hand, student 1 has parents who have connections and can easily afford the university. But student 2 comes from a single-parent household and works a minimum wage job to support his family and therefore cannot does not have the time to apply to college and cannot afford it. These two students have the same functionings, but their capabilities are radically different. One has the freedom to pursue a higher level education and the other does not.
So why is this so difficult to measure? Capabilities and functionings are sometimes hard to distinguish. Capabilities differ from individual to individual, even if circumstances are strikingly similar. For example, a disease like cancer or even a bad flu can manifest itself very different from person to person, affecting their capabilities differently. It would be nearly impossible to judge each person's individual circumstances. Furthermore, capabilities are not quantifiable. There's no mathematical formula that tells that one person has a certain amount of capabilities and another doesn't. It's all subjective. One expert's assessment of a person's capabilities could differ dramatically from another expert's assessment. This makes government use of capabilities to decide who is qualified for aid and who is not nearly impossible. There are not enough resources to send a government adjuster to determine everyone's capabilities, and even there were, adjusters could differ in opinion. So, if we combine the OPM and the SPM and those capabilities that are considered quantifiable into a single formula determined by the states, we would come up with a decent measure of poverty. While admittedly too complex for anyone but a government mathematician to come up with, we need something that captures all components of what can make people poor. Net income compared with cost of living is certainly a component, but again, it falls short of capturing the capabilities of an individual. Factoring in expenses like childcare, transportation, and other work-related expenses and medical out-of-pocket expenses, again, goes further than just the OPM, but falls short of capturing a person's abilities. That's where quantifiable capabilities, like predicted lifespan, leisure hours, education level, and even potentially a relative assessment of health on a numerical scale comes into play. The state should be responsible for coming up with numbers like specific cost of living totals and obviously reporting their state taxes back to the federal government in order to create a more specific total for that state opposed to a nationwide sweeping account. While ideally it'd be better to adjust the formula to individual communities, the cost of living in Roanoke, Virginia is very different than the cost of living in McLean, Virginia, for example. This would begin to get unnecessarily tedious. A formula would be created by experts, again, not us, could numerically assess those things that could be numerically assessed to produce a neat percentile that would fit nicely on a bell curve. While this curve represents equal distribution, a more accurate account would be slightly skewed to show imperfect distribution in the economy. This curve would not only show who's poor and who's not, it would show how poor someone is and who is borderline and who is truly destitute. The curve would give a visual that is easily understood where the formula wouldn't. While admittedly this is more complex than simply looking at income, it might be more difficult to understand for individuals at first. An education campaign could easily help alleviate these problems. Ideally, a national survey could be sent out, and both electronically and via mail for those without access to stable internet connection, much in the way that we do taxes today. Again, while this sounds complicated, it fits neatly into better quantifying how we understand poverty. So the question is, does this create more poor people? Statistically, probably. But it's counting people that previously slipped through the cracks. And while politically uncomfortable, it helps us better determine who in our society needs help and who is just getting by. And additionally, giving the states a little bit more control of certain factors makes this less of a federal political lightning rod. It makes the process more collaborative and truly work.